You start.
Hello, everyone. Andrew and I are pleased to come to you today on this Memorial Day weekend, kind of quiet for us. And we thought we would use this empty space to speak with all of you about something that is deeply on our hearts and is of concern to every person listening. We're going to talk today about trauma and trauma healing. So, Andrew, would you like to begin?
I thought I'd begin by asking you a personal question, and that is, what traumatizes you most about what we are living now?
I think what traumatizes me most is the hospice situation in which our climate is and struggling. I'm really aware that this planet cannot support another billion people with 2 more degrees of global warming. And so, I consider myself and all of us in hospice in a sense. Um, and I don't know what that means in terms of the extinction of our species. I mean, ultimately, it means that we are extinct, but I don't know what might transpire in the meantime. What I do know is that it's not looking good. The other thing that I feel traumatized about most every day is the situation in which we live in the United States and many other countries are living with the diminishment of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism. And then, as we will be talking about next time, a kind of low key trauma that I feel around artificial intelligence and where that is going to take us in the midst of the two horrifying scenarios that I mentioned before.
Mm. Well, let me ask myself the same question. I think what traumatizes me most is the proliferation of the domination of lies, lies that are told in conspiracy theories about the election, about the nature of our world, that so many millions of people are now prepared to surrender all reason, all judgment, not only to believe, but to use as an excuse for truly terrifying, nasty, ferocious, violent behavior. For me, this opens up what I can only call an abyss of pravity of soul, a sign that something essential in human nature is being rapidly and disastrously eroded. Our capacity and our longing for truth. And why it traumatizes me is because, and I'm sure you share this, if this continues, there will be no possibility of us rising to the challenges of our global dark night and even beginning deal with the very extreme crises that our polycrisis is are now exploding everywhere. I've always been someone who had a tragic vision of human nature because of what I myself have experienced and for my own understanding of history and for my own understanding too of the very stark vision of untransformed human nature that is the heart of all of the mystical traditions. But I don't think that anything in my own life prepared me for this abyss. And I'm reeling in front of it, and I'm aghast at it, and I'm deeply heartbroken by it. And more importantly, and I think this is where the trauma sets in, I am absolutely at a loss, as I think we all are, for whatever reason and why, and whatever we say. I'm absolutely at a loss as to how to deal with it. You and I can continue to tell our truth. You and I can continue to write books. You can to continue to evolve inwardly and spiritually. But if there is no common agreement on facts, and if there's no hunger for truth, every noble enterprise of any kind is now potentially rubbled from the beginning. That's what dramatizes me. Does that ring true for you, Carolyn?
Oh, absolutely. And another piece in there that neither one of us mentioned, but I want to mention it, is that I'm increasingly aware as I go out into the world and do my daily errands, go to the post office, go to the gym. As I go into public places, I'm increasingly aware of the danger of violence.
Absolutely.
And I don't think about it continuously. I used to think that, I'm in the Boulder, Colorado bubble, and that sort of thing doesn't happen here, except that in March of 2021, it did happen here. We had a massacre that killed 10 people in a local grocery store. In the most benign place you can imagine, just as the people in Buffalo thought they were in a benign place, the Black people who were assassinated last year, I believe it was, and the children in Uvalde, and on and on and on and on. The violence is really quite unbelievable. I certainly never thought I would live to see that much violence in our culture.
I had dinner with my goddaughter, whom I adore, last week, and she's an exceptionally brilliant, ferocious 32-year-old feminist, and I learn a great deal from her. She's been introducing me to all the great transgender voices that are thrilling me. So she's exactly what the Republicans think most. She's unbelievably intelligent and, I suppose, woke beyond. But she said to me, I am terrified of going shopping.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, oh my God, she lives in Lake Zurich and she's terrified of actually going shopping because she knows that there is no safe space as long as this mad addiction to guns is allowed to continue.
Right. Yeah.
That is devastating.
Well, this
And I
is an
think it's
example.
traumatizing the whole nation.
It's
And the
an
fact that nothing is being done about it
this
compounds the trauma. Yeah.
this is where trauma feeds trauma, because
Yes.
people increasingly get guns in order to be safe, and
Yes.
it only increases the trauma, and it increases the violence, and
And
it's
increases the paranoia that fuels the violence.
exactly. So this is a culture that is highly traumatized, dealing with trauma in all the wrong ways. And I just like to read some characteristics, because maybe people are saying, well, I don't feel traumatized. Some characteristics that I ran into today, which are actually from your alma mater, Oxford University.
Oh, that makes them unimpeachable. I'm so pleased.
Right. One of the characteristics, anxiety and fear. Anxiety is a common and natural response to a dangerous situation. And for people who've been traumatized in their childhood or youth, many things are a dangerous situation because that's where they're still living. Secondly, the re-experiencing of the trauma. Once we have been traumatized, it is very likely that we will continue to relive it in some way, if not consciously, then certainly unconsciously. An increased sense of vigilance, being on guard, be, feeling jumpy, jittery, on edge. Another characteristic is avoidance, which is a common way to manage these symptoms, avoiding situations that remind us of trauma. Now, actually, the opposite can happen, where we plunge into, and I'll be saying more about this in a moment, where we actually plunge into similar situations because we're attached to the trauma. I said, I'll say more about
And also trying subconsciously to rewrite it. I think that's
that.
also
Yes,
very important. We plunge into them subconsciously, hoping for a different outcome. This
absolutely.
happens very often in relationships, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Yes. Also, a kind of low key or maybe high key sense of anger and irritability.
Yes.
People may also have a sense of guilt and shame, blaming themselves for things that they didn't do or had to do in order to survive. Grief and depression, of course, are reactions to trauma. Self-image and views of the world often become negative after trauma. We might tell ourselves, well, if I hadn't been so weak, this wouldn't have happened to me or to my family. We often see upheavals and dysfunction in sexual relationships after people suffer a traumatic experience, or maybe the reliving in a sexual relationship of sexual abuse. And then finally, alcohol or other substances that we use in order to
Medicate, yeah.
numb our trauma, to self-medicate. One of the realities that we have to look at, and you and I have written about this in all of our books, and that
And
is,
especially in radical regeneration, yes.
yes, yes, the collapse of industrial civilization, which
Yes.
we can just call collapse of all the systems, collapse of the ecosystems, financial systems, all of the systems that keep our culture afloat. Those are collapsing. And one of the things that can happen is that as we learn about that collapse, if we're open to learning, we can get drawn into it in a very dysfunctional way
Because of our trauma.
because of our trauma. I work with a number of people regularly for whom this is true. Now, many people, they don't want to talk about collapse. They can only go so far with the climate crisis because it really is too disturbing. But
because of that avoidance that you're
yes,
talking about, that
yes,
is denial, really. Yes.
exactly. So that's one approach to our predicament, our polycrisis, as you
Yes.
said.
Pretend it's not there at all and to
Pretend it's
continue
not
going on. Yeah.
there, or maybe ohm it and schmoem it away with some new age technique.
Yes.
Um,
Which is a traumatized reaction in itself, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So denial, in other words, we can put that word over as the umbrella term over all of that. There's a second kind of response, which is that we become sort of, or not sort of, really addicted to collapse and collapse information. I worked with many.
Become pornographers of collapse.
Well,
It
yes,
becomes a kind of psychic porn to us.
collapse porn, in other words. And the folks that I've worked with who feel drawn into this have often been traumatized early in their lives.
Yes.
And they are drawn into it, as you say, in a way to try to fix it, or with a hypervigilant approach, which is, I have to protect my family from this. I have to protect myself from this. And what actually happens is the actual opposite, the absolute opposite of that, which is, by indulging in constant collapse porn in order to control the outcome, they can alienate the people they love most.
Yes.
And often, report that, well, I can't talk to anybody because they don't get it. I can only talk to people who are as aware of collapse as I am. And so that sets up a situation of all of those symptoms that I just read, plus a sense of alienation and a lack of support. You are really, really alone in the world.
That's it. And it reinforces the trauma. It makes it almost
Absolutely.
intolerable and unable to live with, doesn't it?
It does. And it cuts those folks off from the love that is all around them, that they
Yes.
have difficulty just talking with people as people, unless they're talking about collapse.
Yes.
So I see many manifestations of this in folks that I work with. A third response is what you and I have been offering in our work, and what I'm going to be offering specifically in my next book, which is called Apocalypse Anytime, is an approach to our global predicament that can hold both the horrors of it and the beauty and joy and love that is available to us in everyday life. And I'm sure we're going to say more about that as we continue our conversation.
I love that. I think let's talk about the particular cases that you brought up because I'm meeting them everywhere also. I meet fundamentally three kinds of people. I meet those who absolutely still don't want to face any of the horror and madness of what we're facing, and who come up with all kinds of elaborate reasons for not doing so, including that it's an illusion, that climate collapse doesn't exist, that there is no rise of authoritarianism, that Trump is fundamentally deranged, but not fundamentally dangerous, any imaginable kind of excuse. And there are millions of them. That's about 60% of the people I meet. Then there's 30% of the people I meet who are paralyzed by what they are coming to learn because it detonates every assumption they've ever been brought up with, both of God and of human nature, and of our astounding capacities always to rise from impossible challenges, all the myths, and some of the noblest myths that we've been fed. And as they realize that the global dark night is detonating, destroying, annihilating those myths, they go into total shock paralysis and plunge into fundamental despair as a way of controlling the situation.
Right.
By saying it's completely hopeless, it's completely unmanageable, there's nothing we can do except wait with more or less dignity for the end. And then there are the 10% of people that are waking up to the astounding possibilities for new growth that this disastrous death process we're living through opens up. And these people are characterized by three things. They're characterized by a mature acceptance of impermanence and unknowability and endless possibility, even in chaos, and sometimes especially in chaos. They're characterized by a willingness to let the suffering that is inevitable in our time open them to deeper levels of empathy and compassion for everyone else, including those who don't agree with them, because they recognize that everyone is traumatized in a situation like that. And their recognition of their own trauma makes them much wiser, much more skillful in dealing with all the other different responses to trauma. And you could say, and I think you'd agree with me, that almost all of the responses that we can witness, both on the left and on the right, are now responses born from trauma and limited by trauma. The left says we must destroy everything, we must get everything changed, etc., etc. The right says, in its own way, we must destroy everything and get everything changed, because both are desperate and both are driven half crazy by what they are begin to know.
Right.
And the more you understand your own trauma and the reactions of trauma, the more compassionate, skillful you can be with people on both sides, helping, if possible, for a more mature approach. And the third thing that characterizes these 10 percenters is that they're coming, and I think this is the great meaning of our book, Radical Regeneration, they're coming to understand that we are in an evolutionary process of enormous difficulty and alchemical, anguishing transformation, and that we really don't know completely the laws of this transformation, but that if we sit still and practice and open and love and adore the mystery and cultivate unknowing, extraordinary new kinds of insights will come to us that will enable us at least to make the next step.
Right.
So those three characteristics are of the 10% that I believe the whole future of humanity depends on those 10% of people at this moment, because the deniers and the paralyzed ones are not going to help. It's the ones who are prepared to go through this process with their hearts open, with their minds alert, with their souls focused on mystery and willing to believe in the mystery that's working through this death process to potentially birth a new humanity. Those are the ones who are laying the potential foundations for a new way of being.
Well, as you say that, I'm thinking that those folks that are addicted to collapse porn or addicted to hearing about it will not be useful.
Of course, no.
You are talking about that 10% of folks that are holding the tension of opposites. They're able to hold the reality of collapse and also hold the reality of beauty and joy and real living, even in the midst of death.
Yes.
Those folks, will be helpful, because from that comes, I think, what you have written about so beautifully, sacred activism. Joanna Macy has a wonderful article and video, I think, too, called Collapse as Spiritual Practice.
Yes,
And
it's
so
fantastic. Yes.
collapse needs to be a spiritual practice
It's the
in
ultimate
whatever
spiritual
ways that we
practice.
practice.
Just as
And
dying is an ultimate spiritual, realizing you're dying at every moment, and of course, coming face. That's what I understood most deeply when I worked with the Tibetans to write the Tibetan book of living and dying. And
yeah,
now here we are with the world potentially dying and humanity potentially dying. But what a practice that could potentially be for us
right. And
to
then
achieve liberation.
to not only practice and immerse ourselves in whatever our spiritual practice or tradition is, and if we don't have one, get one. In addition to that, we must do, as you've written about in The Hope, we must become sacred activists. And
Yes.
that looks very different for everyone. There's no cookie cutter model. As you say, follow what breaks your heart. Follow what you really have passion about in this time. It can be something that looks very, very small, but actually isn't, or it could be, something larger. But there is something calling each one of us who's awake to our predicament to do in this world, to serve humanity and the earth.
Well, you're pointing to something very important about trauma itself, is that if you can find a way to use your trauma as a door into the need and anguish of humanity and the creation, and then respond to that need that your trauma itself has opened up to you, then the thing that threatens to shut you down becomes the portal into a wholly new, humbler, more devoted, more service prompted, driven life. And it's not only a question of holding things in in the opposites in balance. That's the fundamental necessity. But then you have to go the next step, which is to realize that the worst things that happen to you can, if you use them as portals into compassion, into recognition of other suffering, of the suffering of the animals, of the suffering of the creation, and if that prompts you to action from your heartbreak, then your trauma turns out to be your best spiritual friend, a friend that makes it impossible for you to live an unexamined life. And I think you and I both know that from the depths of our own life, because we've had multiple personal traumas that may possibly have killed other people, but they haven't killed us. They've made us warrior midwives, people who dedicate their entire lives and their ragged older ages to trying to help people at this moment, because we've been through it. We continue to go through it, but we've been through it, and we know that trauma, when you meet it with the full resources of your spirit and your heart, can become the manure for an unexpected rose of liberation and love and service.
Absolutely. Yes. And I would just like to add to that, we as Americans in particular, and I think
Yeah.
this is true in many European countries, but particularly Americans, we are so spoiled and so entitled. And we think that, this sort of collapse reality has never
For
happened
other
to anybody
people.
else. It's for everybody else. It's not good. It shouldn't happen to us. It shouldn't happen to us. We're entitled for this not to happen to us. And, the reason I love this particular quote by Stephen Jenkinson, where he says, we live in dangerous times, we can accept that as an affliction or as an assignment. The reason I love that quote is that it puts an end right away, immediately, to this notion of, I shouldn't have to go through this.
Yes.
Really? Well,
Yes.
millions and millions of people before us have gone through it. So we are not special. And they have learned, many of them in the past, they have learned what I believe this crisis wants to teach us, which is, what is my assignment? What is my assignment internally in terms of my own evolution? And what is my assignment externally in terms of service?
And what's so strange, and I know this is something you know intimately, is that the answer can be found in your trauma. What has traumatized you most also contains the germ of your essential mission.
Exactly.
What traumatized me most in my life was repeated betrayal by my mother, by convention, by it goes on and on.
Right.
That nearly killed me. But what happened through that repeated betrayal is that part of me realized that the only thing that I needed and wanted was to discover something that could not betray. And that is the divine. I would never have looked so passionately and risked my life to find the divine in this life had I not been so shattered and betrayed. So the betrayals became, in the end, my greatest possible help, because they forced me to do everything in my power to discover what could not possibly abandon.
And let's really emphasize, Andrew, that when you say divine, it's not something out there. It's not a religion. It's not a spiritual teacher.
It's an experience in the depths of, exactly. It's an immanent experience, but it also is an experience of everything out there. But it's not religious. Religions have been founded through those experiences, but they've largely betrayed them by creating all kinds of boys' club hierarchies and rules. But we're living in a time, thank God, in which access to this experience is more wide and more far-ranging than ever before.
Absolutely.
as a kind of divine gift to us in our madness.
Yeah. But the divine is within, and we can contact it through, many practices that are available to us. And then through that, we also begin to appreciate the divine in nature, the divine in animals, the divine in trees and water and all of the elements of the earth, and in each other.
And the divine in trauma.
Yes.
Because we cannot speak after a certain level of consciousness in dualistic terms. We can't say trauma bad, healing good.
Right. Yeah.
Because the kind of healing that you have to really pray for and live through to be able to overcome your trauma takes you potentially to a much higher level of evolutionary truth.
Mm-hmm.
So the trauma then appears as a gift.
Yes.
A terrible gift, what we call in our book savage grace.
Right.
And from this perspective, the global dark night that we are living through, horrifying, terrifying, chaotic, insanely painful, though it obviously is, may very well turn out to be the greatest grace that the human race has ever been given, because if we get through it, we will only be able to get through it far humbler, far more together, far more compassionate, far more concerned with all the other beings, not only human beings, in the world. And then we will be different. We will be transformed. And then we will realize that the thing that we hated the most, this appalling situation, is actually the thing that enabled us to evolve our most spectacular qualities and creativities. That, I think, is one of the great advantages of the mystical awakening, to give you the strength to hold the opposites, but then to realize too that the greatest horror can contain the gift of the greatest possibility, the greatest anguish that you go through can contain the golden seed of a wholly new level of heartbroken compassion for everyone. The greatest paralysis you experience, if you can truly diagnose its roots and work on those roots with grace and with prayer and with deep help from your friends and from psychologists, can become the foundations of your most resplendent creativity. This is the dance of opposites. You don't just hold the opposites, you witness their spectacular dance and try and embody it yourself to be transformed by it.
Well, that's why I want to next talk about trauma healing, because I don't think people can really experience trauma as a gift of healing until they actually do some trauma healing. And so there are 4 names that I really want people to be familiar with as we continue this conversation. Number 1, and many people have probably heard of Thomas Hubble, Hubl. He is an Austrian teacher.
Wonderful.
And he spent, I believe it was 9 years as a paramedic. And then he was in medical school for 4 years and left medical school because he wanted to engage more deeply in trauma healing. So Thomas, Hubl, any books that you can read, any courses you can take by Thomas, please, please do so. The second person I want folks to know about is Stephen Porges, Porges. He's a pioneer of studying the polyvagal nerve in the body, which is deeply involved in trauma. And again, any books you can read, courses you can take with Stephen Porges, please do so. Another person, now Porges is American, Thomas Hubble is Austrian. Another person who's American is Peter Levine, Levine. He founded a type of healing called somatic experiencing, which really works with trauma in the body to heal it in every aspect of our lives. Peter Levine. And finally, an American woman therapist named Deb Dana,
Oh, yes.
Dana. And Deb wrote a wonderful book called Anchored. And I
It's a
love that
superb
book
book, yes.
because it is filled with tools that we can use every single day, whether you're in the car, whether you're in bed trying to go to sleep, whether you're at work, no matter what you're doing, you can use these tools to anchor yourself so that you're not dysregulated by the trauma that you're experiencing inside or that you're experiencing externally. So those four people, Thomas Hubble, Stephen Porges, Peter Levine, and Deb Dana, check out their work and dive into it.
I love what you're saying, and I'd love to add something, and this is perhaps a little controversial, but why not? I am increasingly a believer in some very new and beautiful drug therapies. For example, MDMA, which I have taken myself and which is an absolutely extraordinary portal into divine serenity and bliss and love. It really is the most extraordinary spiritual gift to us, is now being used, thank God, to help people who've been through war trauma, who are veterans who've had PTSD. It's beginning to be approved and it's having spectacular results because it introduces people to an undamaged, radiant, blissful side of their psyche, which has been obscured by trauma, and from which they can derive a great deal of strength and hope and clarity about trauma. The horror of trauma is that it encloses you in its own dark consciousness. And what MDMA and other drug-related techniques can do is to introduce you to a consciousness from which you can see the consciousness you've been in and see it with compassion and start mothering yourself tenderly and opening that consciousness to what you know to be a more fundamental bedrock consciousness. The second drug therapy that is having an immense effect, and I think it really is helping hundreds of thousands of people all over the world now, is ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
I myself have taken ayahuasca 3 times, twice in a Stone Age village in Ecuador, and once in California with an extraordinary woman who had been trained by Amazonian shamans and who understands exactly how to do it and with the kind of sacredness that it requires. And in all 3 experiences, I experienced my fundamental trauma, the trauma of my relationship with my mother, which was very terrifying in many ways. I experienced different aspects of it. I was taught by ayahuasca different subtle inner techniques as to how to deal with the contaminating detritus that that trauma had deposited actually in the depths of my body and in the depths of my psyche and in some of the reactions that pain. So I've experienced myself just how utterly extraordinary and healing these techniques, which come from the depths of the indigenous tradition, which has used them with enormous skill and sacredness and wisdom for thousands of years to heal people. Imagine the kind of traumatic environment which we lived in when we were in indigenous reality. My God, anything could go wrong at any time.
Yes.
And there needed to be, and was, a whole system of deep sacred healing of trauma available to keep the tribe buoyant and together. And thank God at this moment when we need them most, people like Gabor Mate, for example, is using this in extraordinary ways to help addiction, to help all kinds of trauma survival. This, I think, is a really important area of opening and discovery.
What I'd like to emphasize in what you said, there's one word that I really want to emphasize, and that is skill. It is not
Yes.
about just going out and taking
Oh, God,
MDMA,
no.
going out and taking ayahuasca. You need to be with someone who's been trained in how to use it, who can help you use it properly for the most benefit. So
Oh
I
God, yes, you have
strongly,
to be very discerning and
you have
very
to be very
careful.
discerning about it. Absolutely. And
But there are now these institutes, these secret institutes, which you can get in touch with if you want to, where people are being trained by real ayahuasqueros and other masters of Kyoto and others in ways that really enable them to be skillful midwives of others. And if you really want to find a healer like that, you have to look hard and be very discerning, but they do exist. There are many of them now coming on the planet because I think the reason is that many of the older decent modalities work too slowly for what we now need.
the other thing that I want to talk about, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording, and that is the indigenous process of grieving.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of working with Malidoma and Sobonfu Somé before they passed when I was living in California in the 90s. And I was blessed to take part in some of their grief rituals, which were done in a very contained way, a very safe way that allowed people to openly grieve together with loving support. And I've created some of these rituals myself. It's been a while since I've been able to do them in person. Hoping to be able to do another one this fall with a colleague of mine. Done a number of these kinds of rituals online, but I just want to really emphasize the importance of grieving as a place to start healing your trauma. And my great all-time hero of grief saging is Francis Weller, who wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He and his work is, learning about it, reading about it, watching some of his videos is a great place to start. And then again, as you do, Andrew, and as I do, if folks want to work with either one of us, we are here to help folks begin this journey of trauma healing, of grieving, of going deep into oneself to heal and transform, these barriers to our oneness and our completeness and our wholeness with all that is. And if there's anything that
That's so
we need right
important.
now is a sense of connectedness with ourselves, with each other, and with the earth.
In my early 50s, when I was coming up against this horror and realizing, yes, it was coming and coming soon, I had the inspiration to go into Jungian analysis. And I was very blessed because I met Nathan Schwartz-Salant, and Nathan was great psychologist, but even more importantly, he was an exceptionally wise person who had mystical experiences and who was deeply steeped in the Jewish mystical tradition. He came from a family of Hasidic rabbis. So I didn't have to edit anything of myself, but he was able to both expose me to traumas that I had been avoiding seeing and show me from within my own life how I had the resources to integrate them in a larger, wiser picture, both of my life and of the world. So if you are also thinking of analysis, I would not go to a Freudian analyst. I would try and find a Jungian analyst, someone who will enable you to introduce yourself to your own self-healing system, which appears in dreams, which appears in synchronicities, which appears in all kinds of ways and perspectives of seeing your own complexes in such a way that you don't feel trapped by them anymore, but feel them as opportunities for revelation as well as massacres of heartbreak. There are so many modalities available to us now, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we have all of these modalities so vivid and fresh and vibrant around us at the moment when we need them most. But what's needed is two things, which I think Carolyn and I agree on. The first is to acknowledge how traumatized you are, which takes courage,
Yes,
because we all have this fiction about ourselves that we can get through anything and that we're brave and that we're highly
which
spiritual,
is a key symptom of trauma.
which is a key symptom of trauma. And the second thing is to have real radical discernment into who you choose to work with. You must have someone who's been through, who is recognizably healing from their own trauma, and who is humble and loving and compassionate, but will also hold you to certain essential disciplines, because the healing of trauma, so much of the New Age is so idiotic. We all know that. But one of its most idiotic aspects is that it says you can heal trauma just by believing in love and light and dancing and listening to very bad, dreadful New Age music, and that you'll be fine. That is just bypassing trauma. It doesn't heal trauma. It's actually putting a neon bandage on a melanoma, and it's real, and it can actually increase the trauma instead of healing it. And that to really heal your trauma, you have to subject yourself to certain very grueling disciplines. Three, really. First, the intensely demanding effort to identify at its deepest level your trauma, and to dare to identify all the ways it's contaminated and limited your life. And that is very humbling. The second is to really pursue disciplines of healthy thinking, which isn't positive thinking, which is the kind of thinking that Carolyn has been describing, the balancing of opposites, the real, mature, wise, mystical thinking. And you have to combine your healing process with deeper mystical practice, which you take very seriously, because that allows you to be irrigated by grace that propels your healing. So healing trauma involves from us very deep forms of courage and very profound, humble, persistent forms of discipline. But with that courage and that discipline, truly extraordinary things, and I think you and I both know, are possible.
And I want to really emphasize what you just said by saying that this is a process of physical healing. There should be some involvement as you heal from your trauma. There must be some engagement with body work, body practices, because all of this is stored in the body. And that's why I really appreciate Stephen Porges' work and Deb Dana's work, in that they focus so much on this polyvagal nerve in the body, and working in many ways with the body to heal the trauma that is there. And then, of course, it's an intellectual process too, which is why I gave you those 4 names of people that you can learn more from. But it is also a deeply spiritual and emotional practice. And so some form of inner stillness is really, really important. I don't want to call it meditation. I don't want to call it mystical. I just want to call it inner stillness. And there are gazillions of ways to engage in inner stillness. I practice transcendental meditation. I practiced it for 44 years. Other people practice Buddhist meditation. Other people do different kinds of inner stillness practices. Whatever resonates with you, by all means, but it's physical, it's intellectual, and psycho-spiritual. And with those components, we can be truly on our way to wholeness. And Jung said, it's all about wholeness. It's all about becoming whole beings, completely in communion with earth, with the animals, with the water, the elements, and with each other.
What a beautiful place to end.
Indeed, it is. And Andrew, thank you for this conversation.
Thank
I
you,
look
Darlene.
forward to speaking with you in a few weeks about artificial intelligence, and that should be a hoot
Oh,
as well.
yes. I look forward to it deeply. Much love, Karen, and thank you.
You as well.